So 2 seconds. So good morning, everyone. We are doing the second panel of the day of the IBCI conference on competition and innovation. I'm very pleased to be here having this discussion with 3 excellent professors and representing the IBCI here. I want to thank all the audience and the organizers of this conference. And we are going to start with Professor Victoria Robertson. She is professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, where she heads the competition law in digitalization group. She's also professor of international antitrust law at the University of Graz. She holds a law diploma and a doctorate from Graz University and a master from Oxford University. She has clerked with Austrian Supreme Court on competition and trademark matters. And she was visiting academic in a lot of places, very interesting places. And one of them is Rio de Janeiro at FGV. So I think maybe she likes Brazil. And she's a member of the European Law Institute and the Academic Society of Competition Law. She researches digital markets and competition law. And she's the author of an important book, Competition Law Innovation Factor, the relevant marketing in dynamic contexts in EU and US. So Vic, thanks very much for being here, and the word is yours.
Thank you so much. Great, you can see my slides? Excellent.
Yes, yes.
Ok. Bom dia no Brasil, boa tarde na Europa. É grande prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Muito obrigada aos organizadores pela organização deste evento. Hoje vou falar sobre a definição de mercado relevante no direito da concorrência, mas como meu português é limitado, o farei em inglês. So, very good morning to all Brazilians, and good afternoon in Europe, and hello to everyone in between. As I just tried to say in my broken Portuguese, I'm going to talk about market definition. And in fact, it's Magali, Eben, and me who are going to split the talk. Talking about the relevant market concept in competition law and how it's applied in digital markets. And what we will do actually, and what we did is to do a little comparative work on market definition in the European Union, in the United States, and in Brazil. So if you're from one of those jurisdictions and you think we should add something to our research, then please do get in touch. Just to give you an overview of our talk, so I'll be starting with a brief introduction to the importance of market definition and the challenges in digital markets. And then I'll move to the relevant market concept more broadly in the EU, US, and Brazil. And then Magali will take over talking about market definition for digital markets, focusing on multi-sided platforms, zero price services, and ecosystems. And then ending with a comparative outlook. Right, so as we already heard in the previous panel, really, digital markets have been a turning point for competition law worldwide. They've posed new questions that we're trying to answer. And what the current executive vice president of the European Commission said at a conference last year was that it is not for technology to shape our future, but it is for us. So that's also something that concerns us in competition law, of course. How do we want to shape that future? And how can we do that in digital markets especially? As we also heard in the previous panel, digital markets have become an infrastructure, and we might have to apply new rules to these markets. So what is the need for competition law to adapt? There's several needs, really. And it starts with market definition. That's what we're here to talk about this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. But of course, there's other aspects of competition law as well that need to be looked at anew. So starting from market definition, we would then need to look at market power assessments and how we can assess market power, especially in digital platforms, where market definition is already very complicated. We might also have to think about new theories of harm in digital markets, as well as reapplying old theories of harm in those new environments, which can be challenging as well. We also need to take into account new types of competition concerns, and of course, think about how remedies can effectively be applied in those markets, as they're quite different. So let's now turn to market definition, this first thing that we want to reconsider in competition law when we talk about digital markets. Now, as you all know, market delineation or market definition is a central analytical tool in competition laws across the globe. And you can compare this, as I did here on the slide, to the importance of the tennis court in tennis, really. In competition law, the relevant market is the playing field, and competition law provides the rules of the game. And the judge, of course, acts as a referee. Now, if market behavior affects issues that lie outside of the playing field, then the referee signals an out and competition law does not apply. Now, of course, in order to decide whether a ball was inside or outside the court, tennis provides for certain procedures, and the same is true for competition law, where the judge has to determine whether behavior occurred on a relevant market or not. And in doing so, the judge may seek the help of economic experts, just like a tennis referee may use line calling assistance. But importantly, of course, in competition law, it is the judge who is the final authority on all questions of competition law, including on deciding whether market behavior took place on the relevant market or outside of it. Now, there's different types of tennis courts. There's clay courts, carpet courts, grass, hard courts, and they require different skills for line calls. And that's also true for competition law. There's different market environments and they require different skills as well. And in competition law, this we believe is particularly true for digital markets, because here the contours of the relevant market are often uncertain and the referee might be at a loss. Now, before we try to tackle this issue, let's first have a look at the characteristics of digital markets and what makes them so difficult for market definition. So, of course, this list of characteristics doesn't apply to all digital markets. In fact, the term digital markets itself is a little ambiguous. So this is a stylized view of a market that can relate to e-commerce or online advertising, internet search, social networks, the collection and use of big data. And of course, this includes GAFAM, so Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, but it's so much broader than that. So what are those characteristics of digital markets that challenge market definition in a traditional sense? First of all, it is the features of the digital market. We have fast-moving markets very often in the digital realm with short product cycles. And that also means that the market boundaries, or if you want the outside of the court, they need to be questioned on an ongoing basis. In addition, those are very often innovative and dynamic markets. Some call them Schumpeterian. And they're characterized by not only incremental, but radical innovation that overthrows old market orders and, of course, also old market definitions. And that also leads to an inherent uncertainty. Then, of course, we have the features of the digital product. And products in digital markets are often differentiated. They have constantly evolving functionalities. If you just think of your favorite social media platform, you'll have noticed that this is constantly changing. There's always a new functionality being added that shapes demand as well and also shapes the market. But that also makes it, from a competition law point of view, more difficult to establish what interchangeability is sufficient to say this is one relevant market and when it is not sufficient. And there's also what some have termed the seamless integration of technology in the markets, meaning that more and more products become interoperable, and that softens the boundaries of markets. Just think of smart homes. If you have a smart fridge that is connected to a smart home device, and that can tell your supermarket when your fridge is empty and requires a refill of milk, butter, or whatever, then the question is that a food retail market? Is that the fridge market? Is that a whole different market altogether? So new questions really opening up. And then, of course, as a third characteristic group, so to speak, are the dynamics of competition in digital markets. We have a lot of multi-sided platforms that are very present in digital markets. And of course, we know that this is not a new phenomenon, multi-sided platforms as such. We know them from other areas like credit cards and newspapers that are partially financed through ads. But the digital realm surely took multi-sidedness to a new level. And in those platforms, what we often find are direct and indirect network effects. For example, if more of my friends and family are on a certain social media platform, then I want to be there too. So there's a direct network effect. And the more users like you and me are on there, the more advertisers are interested in being on that platform, leading to an indirect network effect. And that can also lead to a lock-in of users, and it can lead to the tipping of these markets. So at some point, demand in these markets concentrates on one platform and the market tips. And once it has, it is very hard to do anything about the cemented market power. Of course, in the previous panel, we heard a lot about data. And so let me just say that user data is another characteristic of these markets that's really important for the business models of many digital platforms, of course, also including big analytics. And here, the versatility of data is a crucial issue. So you can use data for many different purposes, meaning that once you have gathered a good data set that you keep updating, you can use it not just for your home market, but you can extend the use into adjacent or even adjacent market, or even markets that are quite far away. So leading to very useful effects if you're a digital platform. So as I said, multi-sided platforms are a specific characteristic of digital markets that we should pay attention to, also, and starting from a market definition in competition law. Just to give you a kind of representation of what that looks like. So you have on the left side the conventional markets, where you've got a supplier selling to a wholesaler, selling to a retailer, who then sells to us consumers. So a typical vertical relationship. In a multi-sided platform, and here you have a stylized two-sided platform, you've got this platform in the middle, and the market sides, side one and side two in this case, that can only achieve a certain goal through this intermediary, the platform. And that, of course, raises interesting questions from a market definition perspective. What to include in this relevant market? Is it the platform ecosystem as a whole? Is it the platform intermediary as a special kind of relevant market? Is it one market side, both market sides, and so on? And of course, if you look at different platforms, and here's a representation of the Facebook social media platform, there will be different questions. Here you have 4 market sides that are represented. There's more that you could add. So you've got the users, the advertisers, which are usually the 2 market sides that are focused on, but you also have developers, content providers, and so on. So that definitely complicates market definition, the more market sides you add. This just to show you that there's different social media platforms, but also, of course, booking platforms and Google search in this case, where you have similar issues arising. Okay, so let's now turn to market definitions in the 3 jurisdictions that we want to look at. As I said, the United States, the European Union, and of course, Brazil, today's host. So starting with my home jurisdiction, which is the European Union, I just want to briefly set out the current EU framework for market definition. And here, the Court of Justice, in a case many years ago in continental Cannes, said, sorry, the definition of the relevant market is of essential significance. We can only judge the possibilities of competition with reference to a relevant market. And in that case, the court also referred to interchangeability of products as a criterion, and to demand and supply interchangeability. Then the General Court, which is the 4th level of courts in the European Union, said in its Swiss watchmakers case, the concept of the relevant market implies that there can be effective competition between the products or services which form part of it. And it also referred to this concept of sufficient interchangeability that it wants to apply to market definition. Now, what the European Commission has done is to try and synthesize this case law on market definition in a notice of 1997, the market definition notice, in which it talks about the product and the geographic market. And in addition to wanting to summarize the case law, it also wanted to add its own interpretation of what a relevant market is and how it would go about defining it. And that's how it introduced the SNP test, so the small but significant non-transitory increase in prices test, which is essentially identical to the hypothetical monopolist test. Operationalizing the substitutability test that came from the case law. Now, in general, market definition in the EU, but generally I would say, is modeled on traditional static markets that are characterized by incremental innovation, if any. And that, of course, leads to questions when more dynamic markets, as we have it in the digital sphere, come into play. Now, why do we even need to define the market in the European Union? We've got three main areas of competition law: Article 101 on anti-competitive agreements, Article 102 on abuse of dominance, and the merger regulation on merger control. Now, under Article 101 on anti-competitive agreements, we have a number of notices by the European Commission, like the de minimis notice or the effect on trade notice, that use market share thresholds to say when something might not be a competition law problem. Now, to calculate market shares, of course, you need to first define the relevant market. And also to assess anti-competitive agreements when there's an effect, an anti-competitive effect. The Court of Justice has reminded us time and time again that we need to define the relevant market to actually assess an agreement's effects on the market. And then we also have binding block exemption regulations, in which the European Commission says provides a safe harbor for certain types of agreements. And in those as well, you find market share thresholds. Now, under Article 102, to find out what a dominant position, when a dominant position is fulfilled, you will also need to first define the relevant market and also to analyze an abusive behavior. Now, under the merger regulation, the market share of the emerging undertakings before and after the merger is decisive. And also, we want to note about the market structure for analyzing the effects of a merger. So lots of reasons to actually look at markets, relevant markets in EU competition law. Now, what I have found in my research, and Vinícius kindly referred to my book before, is that the relevant market has two main functions in EU competition law, but also in US antitrust law. And that is that first, it is used as a tool for market power assessments. And second, it takes on the function of what I call the market characterization function, so to characterize a market. So what do I mean by that? When it takes on the function of allowing us to carry out market power assessments, I mean things like market share thresholds, where we assume that based on a certain market share, there is market power or there's no market power. So we've seen that under both Article 101 with the block exemption regulations that have market share thresholds, where the assumption is that if often it's a 30% threshold on the relevant market, if that is not achieved, then that means there's a lack of market power in the eyes of the Commission. Or under Article 102, the Court of Justice has stated that if there's market shares beyond 50% in the AXO judgment, then it assumes that there is a dominant position. So those are market share thresholds are being used as proxies for market power or the absence of market power. Now, of course, in the second function, in what I call the market characterization function, the relevant market is used for something entirely different. And it is to look at the more substantive nature of the anti-competitive behavior. For example, under Article 101, to help us appraise agreements in their economic and legal context, and also to assess an individual exemption. And under Article 102, to give us information about the relevant market as a necessary context to understand a certain abuse. And similarly, under the merger regulation, where we need to understand how competition works on a certain market to see if that merger could possibly lead to an anti-competitive outcome. Now, in Europe, we're actually waiting for some changes to market definition. There's a review of the European Commission's market definition notice going on after 23 years, so it's high time. And in addition to that, we're waiting for a new competition tool to be announced this month, which might actually rely on a completely different notion of a relevant market. So that's something to look forward to, but probably the topic of a talk in times to come. Okay, now leaving Europe and moving to another continent, we're going to look at the United States and the current US framework for market definition. The US Supreme Court has also held for a long time that market definition generally determines the result of any antitrust case. And in one of its big cases that also included like quite a lot on market definition, the cellophane case, the US Supreme Court said that you would have to look at qualitative and quantitative analysis to determine the relevant market. Now, for qualitative aspects, it mentioned price, use, and quality of a product. And for quantitative elements, it said you should look at the cross-price elasticity of demand. Now, the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, they issue horizontal merger guidelines together. The last version is from 2010. And in those guidelines, they also set out a test for market definition, namely the hypothetical monopolist test. And what they also said in the newest version of those guidelines is that they want to put less emphasis on market definition for the purposes of merger control. Now, why do we need to define the relevant market under US antitrust law? So first of all, under Section 1 Sherman Act, which is on anti-competitive agreements, there are per se offenses like price fixing, where an effect in the relevant market does not need to be shown. So you would actually not necessarily need the relevant market, perhaps, but you do need it when you want to see whether an agreement is actually entered into between competitors on the same relevant market or not, for instance. And under rule of reason offenses, you need to show anti-competitive effects on a relevant market. So there you would definitely need to look at the relevant market. Under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is on monopolization or attempted monopolization, you also need to show market power on the relevant market. And the Supreme Court has stressed that you need to define a relevant market for this. And of course, the relevant market is also important context for understanding the behavior leading to that monopolization. And then finally, under Section 7 Clayton Act, which is on merger control, the US Supreme Court has stated that market definition is central to US merger control because Section 7 prohibits mergers that would substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly on a specific relevant market. So again, explicitly referring to relevant market. Now, of course, you're all familiar with the cellophane fallacy of applying the price increase in the hypothetical monopolist test to the wrong price. But that's just something I didn't want to leave out when speaking about market definition in the United States. And now let's move to Brazil, our host country for today. And here in the current Brazilian framework for market definition, you of course start by looking at the Brazilian Competition Act of 2011, which actually explicitly refers to the concept of a relevant market on numerous occasions, and we'll come to those in a minute. There's also a CADE resolution of 1999, which tells us what steps to take when assessing restrictive trade practices under what is now Article 36 of the Competition Act, and that includes anti-competitive agreements and abuse of dominance. And the first step to take, as CADE says, is to analyze the market conditions, and that is to delineate the relevant market in its product and geographic dimensions. And then there's also CADE horizontal merger guidelines of 2016 that contain an entire section of 9 pages dedicated to the relevant market. And we'll come to those a bit later. So why do you need to define a relevant market under Brazilian competition law? Under Article 36 of the Act, as I said, it contains prohibitions in the area of anti-competitive agreements and single firm conduct, which for us Europeans is unusual. And one of the possible infringements that Article 36 actually foresees is the control of a relevant product market. So direct reference to the relevant product market, as I said. And Article 36, paragraph 3 of the Act also defines what constitutes a dominant position. And it says that this is deemed to exist from a 20% share of the relevant markets. So a presumption of what constitutes a dominant position directly in Article 36 of the Act. And Article 88 of the Brazilian Competition Act says that mergers need to be prohibited if they create or strengthen a dominant position, or if they may lead to the elimination of competition in a substantial part of the relevant market. And this directly links back to market dominance that is deemed to exist from a 20% market share. Now, as I said, we'll also briefly talk about the CADE horizontal merger guidelines, and they actually also contain the hypothetical monopolist test. So the methodology that CADE relies on, and the hypothetical monopolist test can be one of those. But these guidelines also say that CADE will either alternatively or simultaneously rely on qualitative information, price information, and an analysis of the flow of goods and of customers, and so on, and also quantitative methods. And there's also a comprehensive list of factors in those guidelines that I've listed here on the slide, just to show you the breadth of the market definition exercise that CADE regards as necessary and informative for the subsequent substantive assessment. Now I'll just briefly come to the comparative analysis that we undertook in our joint paper. And what we found on a general level, Magali will then speak about digital markets in particular, is that the EU, the US, and Brazilian competition laws, they all heavily rely on the relevant market as an analytical tool. However, in the EU and the US, market definition was mainly developed through court judgments and by the competition authorities. Now, the Brazilian 2011 Act contains, as I said, numerous references to the relevant market concept directly. And I do think that this provides an important impetus for competition law practice to more actively engage with this concept. Now, in the US, the hypothetical monopolist test is limited to merger review. In the EU and in Brazil, they both adopt this theoretical framework of the hypothetical monopolist test for market definition in all three areas of competition law. So anti-competitive agreements, abuse of dominance, and merger control. Now, substantively, this test is almost identical in all three jurisdictions, and that's probably not least because economics serves as a focal point for this test. Now, of course, there's also a debate on whether market definition should be the same or different. If you look... Sorry. So there's this debate on whether market definition should be the same or different, depending on the type of competition law infringement you're looking at. And I think the Brazilian Competition Act actually gives as an instructive example, because it only has this one prohibition for anti-competitive agreements and unilateral conduct in Article 36. And that does go to show that such a differentiation of market definition would probably be inadequate in the face of one uniform prohibition. And the same should also apply to other jurisdictions. Now, we've definitely seen a convergence in the principles, in the benchmarks for defining a relevant market in the three jurisdictions, both in terms of qualitative criteria like product characteristics, price, intended use, but also in quantitative measurements like the hypothetical monopolist test. And that's the theory. Now, in practice, of course, there can be divergence in the application of these general principles. And as Magali will show in a minute for market definition in digital markets, frictions can arise when similar markets are delineated based on the same general principles in different jurisdictions, particularly in areas of the economy like digital markets that are not yet marked by well-established ways of delineating relevant antitrust markets. So what are those challenges ahead for market definition in jurisdictions across the globe at the moment? That's first of all to find out what is actually the product in digital markets. These markets have so many facets, so many functionalities that are evolving that it can be difficult to actually find this important point of departure. Then, of course, something that Magali will also turn to are zero price markets actual markets, and how can we take into account a market's multi-sidedness? Also, what is the role of ecosystems in market definition? And how should we deal with those fast-moving markets that are so prone to overthrowing old market definitions? Also, how do we delineate integrated markets that are interoperable, but where there's only partial substitutability or one-way substitution? And finally, are online and offline markets part of the same relevant market? So lots of open questions still to be answered, and I'm looking forward to discussing some of those with you in the discussion later. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Vicky. You are going to keep sharing your screen, or is it going to be Magali?
Magali will share hers.
I'll share my screen, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your wonderful and insightful presentation. It was very nice, and this comparative analysis is very important. And besides showing a lot of knowledge about the subject, you also showed a lot of knowledge about Portuguese language. It was very nice, your initial talk. It was a very nice Portuguese. So now let's have Professor Magali Eben. She is a lecturer in competition law at the University of Glasgow, where she teaches EU competition law and US antitrust law. She was a visiting researcher at Georgetown University. She teaches competition policy summary classes at the London School of Economics. And she consults for a lot of firms and a lot of topics in EU and antitrust law. She holds a PhD from the University of Leeds, where she addressed the key market definition problems for online service. So, and she also is the co-director of the ASCOLA chapter in UK. So thank you very much, Magali. It's an honor to have you here, and the word is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up where Vicky left off, because as she said, we are working on a joint paper together. And I'll look at specifically challenges for digital markets. And the challenges I will focus on are multi-sided platforms, zero price services, and ecosystems. My plan is to give a brief introduction. I'll try to keep it brief, the problems for each of these challenges, and compare across the 3 jurisdictions to come to some tentative conclusions on them. So Vic has already explained multi-sided platforms, so I don't have to spend much time on that. One thing I did want to add is that there is a distinction made in the literature when it comes to multi-sided platforms between transaction platforms and non-transaction platforms. And this is actually a distinction which has become important in decisional practice. The distinction here is between platforms who obviously enable a transaction between the 2 customer groups, the 2 sides, and those that don't. So if you think of a transaction platform, you're really thinking of a platform which offers a service to a group on one side, which is at the same time also offered to the other side. So the 2 sides, the 2 customer groups, are both necessary for the transaction to occur, and it occurs at the same time. The traditional example of this is payment systems, and it's also one that I will look at for the decisional practice. The idea that you as a seller, you can only use your credit card, you as a buyer, you can only use your credit card to pay for a product if there is a seller willing to accept that credit card. And the system, the payment system, will enable that payment from the buyer to the seller. And obviously, therefore, you need both the buyer and the seller for that service to be supplied. But you also have transaction platforms online, and you have loads of transaction platforms in apps that we use on a regular basis. So if you want to take a car through Uber, for example, or another ride-hailing platform, well, that rider, that passenger will only be able to get a ride if there is also a driver willing to take up that request for a car. The same thing when you book a hotel room through booking.com or through Airbnb, you will only be able to book a room if there is someone willing to rent out that room. This might seem obvious, so why am I telling you? I'm telling you because that concept of transaction has become very important when we look at market definition. So what are the problems with market definition for multi-sided platforms? Well, there really are 2 main problems. The first problem is how many markets do you define? If you have multiple customer groups, multiple sides like Vicky explained, then does each side represent the own market, a distinct separate market, or do you define one market for the whole platform that includes all the sides in one market without making a distinction? That has implications for the second question, which is how do you take into account the relationship between the different sides of a platform? Now, I'm going to focus on the first question because you can't answer the second question of this relationship until you have established how many markets there are. And this really ties in with something else Vicky mentioned, namely how complicated it is to figure out what products are online, right? So what kind of desire is being satisfied by these digital companies? What is the want of consumers? What is the product that they offer? And I think this is a crucial question when it comes to multi-sided market definition. Defining multiple markets or just one market has immense implications. First, for the substitutes that you can add to the market. If you need a single market with all the sites, then it is likely that substitutes will only be those platforms who also incorporate those same sites. Whereas if for each customer group, you look at them separately as a distinct market, you could have a wider variety of substitutes in the market. Moreover, it has implications for effects analysis. One of the cases I will refer to is the American Express case in the US, which has been extremely controversial. And market definition was a crucial point there, because how many markets you defined had an impact on the effects analysis. And there was an argument that had the market been defined differently, the case would have had a different outcome. So market definition has a clear link with the effects analysis. I'm going to look at two types of cases. We're looking at payment card systems, and these aren't online traditional digital markets, but they're very important for the lessons we can draw from them. And then more specifically, cases which look at search and social networking. I'm starting with payment systems, and I just want you to have a look at this really like basic, simplistic flowchart of a payment system. The cases I will refer to are credit card cases, which involve Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and others. And they are often considered to be transaction platforms because they allow a payment transaction between a buyer, a card holder, and a merchant, a seller. Now, in reality, it's much more complicated than that, because some cards, like Visa and MasterCard, also have another level of banks. So it's not that the transaction is between the cardholder and the merchant, but between the banks that represent them. This is an added level of complication, which actually has made some of the cases so detailed that you can't draw any lessons from them anymore. They're detailed for a good reason, because this is a complex system, but as a result, the lessons on market definition get lost. This is the case in European Union and Brazil. And the European Union and Brazil, on these administrative decisions by the European Commission, by CADE, which are really fascinating cases and really well thought out, you see that they define different markets for each of the levels on this flowchart. This can be a different market for the cardholders and their banks, a different market for the merchants and their banks, and a different market for the whole network that is run by Visa, by MasterCard, by American Express. As a result, despite the fact that when I read the cases, I think the outcome was probably right, the market definition is complex, is convoluted, and doesn't help us figure out exactly what we're supposed to do in future cases. A lot of people have said that these are precedents for saying that you need to define a distinct market for each side on multi-sided platforms. But I'm afraid to say that because I think the cases were so detailed and so case fact specific that there was no intention to establish a general rule for market definition. And so it's difficult to draw any real conclusions from them. This is different from what you have in the United States. In the United States, there were lower court cases on payment card systems, and eventually we got the infamous American Express case by the Supreme Court. These cases are different, first of all, because they're by courts. So the precedent value of these cases was higher. Moreover, because market definition in American Express was so controversial and became such a big topic of debate, the Supreme Court actually spent quite a lot of time thinking about it. Now, this is in 2018, it's much later than the cases we have in the European Union and most of the cases in Brazil. So as a result, by that time, the US already knew all of the stuff that had happened in the two other jurisdictions and could say, okay, maybe it's time for us to come up with a conclusion. Did they come up with a conclusion? Not really. It was so controversial that there was a 5-4 vote. That's not really enough to say there is a clear majority for one choice over the other. In fact, if you look at the amicus curiae briefs in this case, there were more briefs saying how wrong the Supreme Court was in its decision than how right. Now, I remember when I did my interview at Glasgow for the job, I was asked whether the American Express case was right or wrong, and I stood there thinking that's a ridiculous question because it would take me 5 hours to answer it. I'm not going to take 5 hours. Here, I'm just going to tell you that I think probably we can learn much more from the American Express case than some authors want to. The reason for that is because they can't separate the fact that the market that was defined in the American Express case had real consequences for the effects analysis. So let's take a step away from the effects analysis and think about what happened in this case. In this case, the Supreme Court said, we are defining a single market, including both the merchant and the cardholder site in one single market because there is a joint product. They started from the product and said, what desire, what want of consumers is being satisfied here. And they were saying that even though there were different customer groups, they had a joint desire. There was a joint product. And because the product couldn't be supplied to one group without the presence of the other, they said there was one product and therefore one market. This is controversial, and I'm happy to debate in Q&A about whether it was right or wrong, but it is logical, right? Whether you agree with the logic or not, it is logical. There is a joint product, so there is one market. This has consequences for the substitutes you can include, because as a result of that, you can only include as substitutes platforms which also offer that kind of joint product that have the same two sides. So these payment card cases are about transaction platforms. And indeed, the American Express case can, at the very most, be a precedent for transaction platforms. It doesn't tell us anything about non-transaction platforms. So the desire for a uniform guidance and theory after American Express just wasn't realized. So we learn about how to treat transaction platforms when they have a joint product, but it still has a lot of questions. So first, with the joint product, this transaction product, you could only have substitutes which offer the same two-sided product. But this got me thinking, because online, it is possible, for example, to have an online payment system similar to PayPal, for example, or similar to some of the payment systems that allow you to send payments through WhatsApp, where you would have someone receiving a payment and someone sending a payment. But what if that kind of online payment system added a third side and said we're going to add advertisers so that we can reduce the fee of these transactions to the cardholders and the merchants and just monetize it through advertising? Would that still be a substitute? There isn't any indication that we have in the decisional practice on how we would treat that. So we're not there yet. Added to that, it didn't give us any guidance for non-transaction platforms. And most of the big cases we've been caring about, Facebook and Google, are non-transaction platforms. You can't say that there is a simultaneous product being offered to a user and an advertiser. There is no simultaneous product. Indeed, you don't click on every ad every time. You might watch 5 ads for one product or none at all. There is no simultaneous interaction. So the logic of a transaction product just doesn't apply. Do the cases that we have so far help us? Well, there are cases on digital services. There are cases on non-transaction platforms. And if you spend a lot of time reading them word by word, you can pick out words that you like, which is what I was doing for the paper. It's a bit disingenuous because when you read the cases, it's not as if CADE or the European Commission actually wanted to establish a clear framework for market definition. It's just me picking words that I think fit with my narrative. One of the words that I pick when I look at the European Union's decisions, for example, is in the Google search shopping case. The European Commission calls the two-sidedness of the Google search platform a commercial strategy. To me, that implies that it says it's not necessary to have both sides. If you combine that with the fact that in all of these cases, they've always looked at each side separately, that implies that potentially for non-transaction platforms, you would always have separate markets for each customer group, for each side. Now, I was very happy when I started reading the CADE decisions because I found one vote by Bandera Maya who says, actually, there is a distinction. And for non-transaction platforms, you need to consider substitutes from the perspective of each individual customer group. So I think that's one of the first indications that people are actually thinking about this distinction now. So what can we learn from these digital services cases combined with the payment card cases? You could say not very much because there isn't an overall guidance. But if you look at the very specific words used, it might lead to the tentative conclusion that there is a general feeling that for non-transaction platforms, every site is its own market, whereas for transaction platforms, there is a joint product. We still would need more guidance, more clarity, an overarching approach, I think, rather than this piecemeal approach we've seen in cases so far. This ties in actually with the next challenge, which is the zero price service challenge. The fact that because a lot of these services are advertising funded or funded because our data is used to provide analytical services to other companies, there is no money being exchanged. When I search for something on Google, or I log into Facebook to send a message to my grandma, which now is apparently the main target audience for Facebook, I am not paying for that. I'm not paying to be able to say to my grandma, have you managed to put WhatsApp on yet? I am, however, offering my personal data to the platform. I am watching advertising that I scroll through on the news forum. So I'm not providing any money for that service. And Facebook used to say it's free and always will be, although I think it dropped that message on its platform now. At least I couldn't see it when I tried to log in recently. But it's true, right? The business model is based on the idea that you get this service for free. There are advertisers on the other side who do pay, but you as the user, you don't pay for it. This is a problem. The problem here is twofold. First, there was this major question for a while whether you could even define a market for something that is free. And remember what I said, for these kinds of non-transaction platforms, the tendency has been to define a market for each site. But could you define a market for this user site, for the social network side, if it was free, if no money was being exchanged? I am happy to say that some of the earlier cases where they said there was no economic activity and no market were obviously wrong and have now been accepted as being wrong. In fact, there is now legislation in different countries that explicitly says that even though no money is being given up, users give up data, they give up attention. So there is some kind of commercial relationship and therefore a market. That still leaves us with a second problem, which is how do you determine who the substitutes are to the service? Most of the tests that are advocated as being the most robust are quantitative. So Vicky told you about quantitative analysis, and the key here, idea here is that you would increase the price of the product you're investigating and try to figure out whether your consumers would switch to another product. If they did, then that other product would be a substitute. Well, you can't really do that if there is no price. And this has been a stumbling block for substitution analysis for zero price services. Some of the solutions in the decisional practice, the first solution, which is also obviously wrong, is the suggestion that you should just imagine that there is a price, right? Okay, there is no price. Oh, let's just imagine there was a price. And if there was a price, what would happen? This is obviously wrong because this ignores the idea of the zero price effect. The zero price effect is that users, consumers will actually consider the product to be completely different, to satisfy completely different desires, whether there is a price and where there is not a price. There was a test done where you could give someone Hershey's chocolate, which in my mind is, I'm sorry if I offend anyone, the most low quality chocolate in the world, but it was free, so everybody took it. And if you gave them Lindt chocolate, they wouldn't take it because it had a price. And then they tried to figure out, okay, if it has a 0.001 price, does that change anything? And suddenly, yes, the thing that was free and everybody wanted it, once you gave this nominal price, nobody wanted it anymore. So you can't do that. You can't just imagine there is a price. You will get a completely wrong answer. All right. Now, okay. But then there is a question, what else can you do? If you can't use a price in quantitative analysis, maybe you could use quality as a parameter. This is a test developed in the literature, in the scholarship, and there were references to it in the decisional practice. The European Commission refers to it on multiple occasions. Yesterday, there was a complaint released against Facebook in the US, which refers to degradations of quality. So there are some indications that the idea of a quantitative test based on quality would actually be a viable alternative to a SNP test or a hypothetical monopolist test. But there is no fully fledged application of it. I couldn't find a case that actually goes through it, at least in these jurisdictions, goes through it in detail and tries to do it properly. Now, alternatively, we could say, okay, actually, these users do pay. They pay with their data, they pay with their attention. And although you see reference to this, there is no real use of this so far in decisional practice. But who knows, maybe one day someone will. I wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, and I'm still waiting for some authority to try to use personal data as a price. So here's a call, please do it. I'm happy to see your results. If you can't use quantitative analysis, you use qualitative analysis. You compare the characteristics of products to figure out whether they are substitutes. This, in my mind, is an understandable alternative, but it's deeply flawed. And you can tell it's deeply flawed because very often there is random picking of the characteristics of a product in order to make the narrative fit. We think these are the characteristics that consumers like. We've interviewed a few consumers to ask them what they like about the search engine. And so we'll find any other search engine with the same characteristics and say it's a substitute. This is understandable, this approach, if you can't use a quantitative analysis, but it leads to conflict. And you see this even in the CADE decision on Google Shopping, because the superintendent and many of the commissioners were saying that general search and vertical search were distinct. They had different functionalities. They satisfied different desires. There was different clicks. The number of clicks that a user needed to go through differed. But then you have Bandera Maya, who reflects, who says, I'll side with the majority, but can I just point out that actually no one sits down behind the search engine with the idea of, I want a vertical search, I want a general search. It is all one search for information. So focusing on the same functionalities and characteristics, there were two different results. That in itself indicates that qualitative analysis has its downsides. So if we want quantitative analysis, then we need to find a way to incorporate quality or data in it. If we can't do that, we can stick with qualitative analysis, but we need to improve it. It is just not fit for purpose the way we're using it now. So clearly, there has been some movement on zero price services. It's really good that we recognize in decisional practice that there is a market. It's really good that we refer to quality and data, but we need to now actually be robust and develop a framework that works across the board. And the last challenge is the ecosystem challenge. Now, this, I think, might be the most fascinating because you might have heard the least about. The idea of an ecosystem actually is really old. So we talk about it recently for digital services, but it is really old. But it's now pervaded our lives. Most of us are tapped into some kind of ecosystem. So the idea here is that you have a company which offers a wide variety of products, and these are either linked because they're complement, or they're linked by sheer virtue of being offered by a particular company. Think about it. If you have a Google account, that Google account gives you access to a wide variety of products. Those products might not be complements to each other, but they are linked by virtue of being offered through your Google account. I just put a few images here. These is just like a snapshot of all the different things you can get through a Google account. It's software products, it's hardware products, all of this linked to a Google account. This is an ecosystem. It's all linked together. Now, when you define a market, do you define a market for each individual product? Do you define a market for the smartwatch? Do you define a market for the Chromebook? Do you define a market for the search engine? Or is it an ecosystem that is a whole market? Do you define a market for all these products that are linked through the Google account? And if so, how do you determine what is in the ecosystem and what isn't? Where are the boundaries between products? Which products do you want to buy together and which ones do you not buy together? This is complicated, and there isn't much being written about how to approach this for digital services. Decisional practice hasn't really given us an answer to that, but I would argue it does have an answer to it, because there are two types of cases that we have seen in the past. The first is cluster market cases, and the second is technological tie-in cases, which actually give you an answer. The first are cluster market cases. Cluster markets are one-stop shop markets. This is like supermarkets or banking, financial institutions. These are companies who give you a package of products as a basic service. In the US, there is a long history starting in the 60s of market definition for clusters, for products together as one package. And then once you have that package, only other packages are substitutes for that package. We could use that as inspiration for the ecosystem market definition. You also have similar cases in the EU, but a lot fewer of them, called the one-stop shop supermarket cases. The problem, however, with this cluster market idea, which I explored in my PhD and spent way too much time on, is that there's like 15 different theories of how to do it. 15 different theories interpreted by dozens of different lower courts and a handful of Supreme Court cases, all of which establish different criteria and for different industries. Now, I think we could take all these cases and distill them into one coherent theory, but that would have to happen before we can use it for ecosystems. The last but not least thing is technological integration. And I'm putting this one here because, again, there was a reference to this in the Brazilian Google Shopping case. And I really like the Brazilian Google Shopping case because all of the things that I think the EU and the US just didn't think of putting in, the Brazilians were like, wait, maybe we should put that in. In the US, there is a line of reasoning in the lower courts when it comes to tie-in cases, that there is no illegal tie, no illegal bundling of products, if by integrating products, it creates new demand that is more efficient or that fundamentally changes the satisfaction of consumers. Google may try to make that argument in Google Shopping in the EU, and the European Commission was like, whatever. And then it tried to make that argument in Brazil. And what I really liked is that in Brazil, they said, that's an interesting argument. We could transpose it from tie-in cases to market definition. Unfortunately for you, Google, it doesn't apply to the facts in this case. But it didn't dismiss it. It said, no, but it did think about it for a few seconds, right? And I would like the thinking about it to happen a bit more in the future. So I think we have a possibility to develop a coherent framework for ecosystems. We're just not there yet. Which brings me to my last slide, which is basically a call to arms. So the Google Shopping case, the president, I am not sure if I pronounced this right, but Barreto de Souza, I don't know if that was rightly pronounced, but at some point made a speech about the fact that the EU, the US, Brazil were very different. Markets have different characteristics, the competitive conditions are different. And so it's normal that we have different answers. True. On a case-by-case basis, that makes sense. But these are global companies. They span across borders. And if they are across borders, then why aren't we? Why aren't we sitting down and developing a coherent framework together? I mean, like in his words, to steal his words, Brazil could build bridges, right? Brazil, in its more recent cases, actually looks back at what happens in the US and the EU and takes inspiration from that. Why couldn't it do that to lead the way forward? We have some indications in the jurisprudence and still a lot of questions. And I am hoping, kind of, this is a plea, that Brazil takes the questions and makes them coherent in the answers. So that's it. That's the conclusion on this joint paper.
So thank you very much, Professor Magali. Your presentation was brilliant, also as Vic. So it is very nice for us at the IBCI to have this panel with this joint paper and joint discussion. It was very important. Now we're going to have our last guest today, Professor Paula Farani. Professor Paula Farani is a commissioner at CADE, at Brazilian Competition Authority. She participated in a lot of cases about digital markets, and she is a professor of Law and Economics and International Trade at the Brazilian Institute for Public Law. She holds a master's in International Economic Law from Georgetown University and a law degree from University Center of Brasilia. She worked as a coordinator of the former Secretary of Economic Law on cartel and unilateral conduct investigations. And the word is yours, Paula. Thank you very much for participating.
Vinícius, first of all, thank you. It's nice to see you again. Congratulations to the IBCI for organizing this conference. Unfortunately, I missed many of the panels, but I'm going to make sure that I review them, since many of my friends and colleagues were speakers, and I'm very interested to hear what they said. I'm really happy to be on this panel. First of all, because I think market definition is something that is sometimes taken for granted in antitrust analysis, and now with the challenges that digital markets are bringing, we are being forced to reflect upon whether or not market definition is necessary, why it's necessary, and how to evolve on this issue, which is, has been around for over a century. The presentation that was given by Professors Victoria and Magali were so thorough that and were so interesting that I'd first of all like to thank you and congratulate you on your presentation. And I'm going to just present a few comments from the Brazilian perspective, from as an authority on, as a CADE member. And I have actually some questions for the professors at the end, if I may. Just, don't want to put you on the spot. I thought of a few things while you were speaking. I would love to hear your thoughts on. So first of all, is market definition necessary? Under Brazilian law, I would say yes, it is necessary, even though there are some cases in this, coming from drawing inspiration from the US and EU, in which there are some cases that say that market definition is not an end in itself, but rather a tool. And so if it's not possible in that case to define a market exactly, then you may look at the conduct and the consequences and the effects on the market and extract a market definition from there, or simply not define the market and go straight to the analysis. Personally, I believe that we should always continue to take market definition very seriously, and this should be the first step. Market definition is essential, as has already been said, to not only define the market, the limits of the competitive pressures that are on that market, and to avoid fallacies. The cellophane fallacy, we have the Kodak decision, and I mean, I could point out several under Brazilian from CADE that in my opinion have this kind of issue, but for diplomatic reasons, I'm not going to right now. Maybe I can do that in a couple of years' time. But what I would say is, if the market isn't defined properly, we could go to a decision such as, I like the Aspen skiing decision, because I think it shows very clearly how market definition can make or break a case. So the Aspen skiing decision, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it's a unilateral abusive dominance case in the US in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. It was tried by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court defines the geographic market as being Aspen destination skiing. But if you think about who actually chooses, who the consumer is, these are wealthy Americans and others that enjoy skiing resorts. So why Aspen by itself, and why not include neighboring resorts, or even resorts in other mountains and other high-end ski resorts, even in Europe, for example. So this obviously is a critique that has been made several times in the literature, and I'm not saying anything new, but it's an example of how market definition can break or make a case. I think the Google shopping case in Brazil is another example of how market definition can make or break a case. Obviously, I participated in that decision, and I have my own opinions, which are in the case records. But stepping a little bit away from my own opinion, I think that hearing Professor Magali's take on the case was very interesting. She said a few things that I hadn't necessarily thought about in a while. But one of the issues that has always bothered me has been the ecosystem aspect of the case. So if obviously Google is a non-transactional platform, And there's the issue of whether it's multi-sided or if we should define it as 1 or 2 markets. Personally, I like most of the market definition that was made by Bandera Maya. I think he did what Professor Magali said, that incorporate the best of the best. So what's the best in the EU? What's the best in the US practice? And let's try and bring that to Brazil and see how it applies specifically to our facts. But I think something that CADE has yet to acknowledge, and this is not only CADE, but several other antitrust authorities, is that a lot of the non-transactional platforms today are ecosystems. And this changes the tying rationale, the leveraging rationale, the substitution rationale. So market definition becomes crucial in understanding exactly what the rationale is behind the conduct. So when we're talking about a rule of reason unilateral case, we have to first of all determine the market definition in order to know whether we're talking about a dominant player or not. Is it a monopolist, or are there other substitutes? And finally, what is the reason behind the violation? Is it a naked restraint? There's no way to know whether or not it is a naked restraint if we don't properly understand the theories and how what the rationale is. And I think the rationale is very different if we begin by defining several markets or 1 market or an ecosystem. Another thing that I believe antitrust authorities and market definitions have yet to properly assess is how choice architecture, zero price effect, and behavioral biases affect market definition. Once again, the qualitative analysis that was mentioned by Professor Magali in the Google shopping case is very interesting, because there is the revealed preferences theory that is basically being applied to digital markets. However, there's such extensive literature that shows that consumers are being manipulated, or these products are addictive, and so they have other consequences. And when you add that to how consumers are behaving, is it still appropriate to say that because a consumer clicks on this link or spends this much time on a page, that it means that they would prefer this to that? So I think that this has still not been adequately incorporated into into the antitrust tools that we have. There's more to be done. So speaking of the antitrust tools, there is the proposed quality test, there is the proposed SNP privacy test, and I can tell you personally, as an enforcer, it's very difficult to incorporate these tests because of essentially we don't have the data. A lot of the time we don't have access to the data. The data is the companies, and in Brazil specifically, we have limitations on what kinds of data requests we can make on the companies. But I think there's another issue, which is not necessarily a problem with the authority, but something that still needs to be thought through a little bit more, which is price quality and privacy are different to different people. So it's not a linear, it's not quantitative as prices. So privacy to me can have one value, for someone else it can have another. When you add in the zero price effect, it changes completely the valuation of privacy. So we end up in a qualitative my opinion, I may be wrong, but we end up having a qualitative analysis disguised as a quantitative analysis. And obviously I would love for someone to come up with an accurate quantitative analysis for privacy and quality, because that would solve a lot of problems for market definition. But we have to recognize that today it is a qualitative analysis. And then I would reference back to a lot of the critiques that Professor Hovenkamp has made to qualitative analysis in the rule of reason, which is you can't compare two things with different values. So it's a lot like comparing apples and oranges. You'll end up with a qualitative analysis that will be very subjective. So let's maybe try to avoid that and avoid getting to that step and stopping before, a little bit before that point. So CADE's experience to date has been very limited because of the limited number of cases that have reached us. But I think that we have been successful in trying, to keep one step ahead of what's going on. We're trying to innovate in our theories. We know that you can't use traditional antitrust to solve all of the digital market problems, and I think that echoes a lot of what the professors have said here today. But there is one thing that I think I'm already nearing the end of my time, right, Vinícius? Or I've already exceeded my time?
No, you can speak more, no problem.
Yeah, I'm okay? Okay. I forgot to set the timer, sorry. But for example, a practical case that we had in the past, which is the MFN clause for booking platforms. This is a case that happened, basically, I think Brazil, EU, US, maybe a few other jurisdictions. And so this is a transactional platform. And if we apply the American Express theory to this, we have one platform, one product. So hotels wouldn't necessarily compete with these booking platforms, right? Because it's not it doesn't have the same transactional nature. So an MFN clause in order for hotels to have the same price, does that make sense? That would be one of my first questions. So is this correct market definition? Does this tie in together well with the theory and the practice, I guess is my question. And the second thing that I was thinking about is if we go down the path of non-transaction platforms as separate markets with a multi-sided nature, which is, I think, how academics and all of the theory right now it's heading kind of down that path. But we also understand that these are ecosystems. So the rationale is a little different. The rationale is not that I want to dominate all of my third markets and vertical markets, but rather I want to extend into these markets to defend my position in my original market, which is where I not necessarily get all of my money, but where I get all of my data, which is what enables me to then sell to advertisers and provide a good watch and a good home device and all of that. So if we do this, then will ecosystems only be able to compete with the ecosystems? And how do we, when we're analyzing a conduct that's a violation, for example, that's very clearly linked to one device, so let's say watches, do I not understand that other watches are substitutes or are in the same market as the Google Watch because the Google Watch is within a platform and an ecosystem? What are the limits here? Are we going to have to maybe acknowledge that there's one broader relevant market that also to some extent applies competitive pressure or receives competitive pressure from a second or a third relevant market? Or is there another way of thinking about this that maybe I'm not seeing? So I would be really interested in getting your opinions on this. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paula. It's a very nice to see you again, virtually this time, and brilliant comments. And I think you put very important questions here. And I'm gonna have the word from Vicky and Magali. I don't know who wants to speak first.
Should I just raise some answers and then Vicky can raise some others and then we can see what we didn't cover?
Okay.
Sure.
Yes.
One of the things that Paula said, which really I can't resist but to pick up on, is you were referring to quality and privacy as qualitative analysis rather than quantitative, and I think that's a brilliant comment to make. My pushback here is that when I wrote my article about personal data in the SNP test, which now if I could do over, I would. But actually, I tried to frame it that personal data operates like price. So price is a medium of exchange. We offer something for something else. Data does that too. And if you look at data that way, it operates the way the SNP test conceives of price. The reason we look at price is because it really is a factor that reflects on different considerations, on quality considerations, but on loads of considerations a consumer has when they buy. So what I try to do is step away from the privacy aspect of data and focus on how it can operate to reflect consumer preferences rather than be about privacy. I think it's possible, and I still think it's possible. I think you can develop a test, which was basically what I was trying to argue in that article, because there are already indications on the value of personal data as a medium of exchange. I mean, I use this thing called Citizen Me, but there's other platforms like Dataku, which allow you to buy things with your personal data, or receive personal data in exchange for surveys and money for that. So I think it is easier to make personal data quantitative than it is to make quality quantitative, because quality doesn't have the same medium of exchange value to it. Doesn't mean it's easy. It will be complicated. But I think it is possible, and if more people put their minds to it, we might actually get a good test out of it at some point. So that's on that point. You made so many good points. I can see us, me and Vicky, sitting down later and just re-watching and thinking, okay, how do we incorporate this and that? So thanks for that. You raised good points about the booking platform and the ecosystem. One of my pushbacks, and I know not everybody is going to like this, is, which ties in kind of with the market characterization idea, but more broadly with the idea of purposive market definition, is that you don't need one answer. An ecosystem might be the market in one case, but the watch might be a market in another. It depends on the conduct that is being investigated. I think it is right to think that a smartwatch might compete with other watches as an individual product, depending on the preferences of consumers in that particular situation. But in another case, it might be right that the watch is part of the ecosystem and that the ecosystem is the starting point. I know it's a bit of a cop-out, but I think that's the answer. You can't have a one-size-fits-all, and it's one of the things I think we don't acknowledge enough. The booking platform question is an interesting one, and I was trying to think it through whilst you were saying it. I think if you apply American Express to it, yes, it's a transaction platform. It is a single market. From the perspective of consumers, I can see that for them, booking through the hotel or booking through a platform likely might satisfy different preferences if what they want is a wide array of choices. So I think it's one I need to sit down on and think about. I think the American Express logic of a transaction product makes sense for its principle, namely that it reflects demand. It reflects the demand of those customer groups to have a joint product. That doesn't mean we can necessarily transpose it to every situation, but maybe Vicky has a better, more robust answer to it.
So I take it that's my turn to take over. Great. So thank you so much, Paula, for all those comments. As Magali said, we're taking notes and going to re-listen again. So one remark you made was before I get to your questions, was that quality and privacy are different to different people. And I agree, but I also think that price is different to different people, because like 100 reais are different to me than to my local, lady sitting at the supermarket till. So I think what I want to say with that is, when we look at those quantitative tools that we have this false sense of accuracy. And so that I just want to take that into account as well. It's very difficult, but just to make sure that when we look at those quantitative tools, we don't think like, okay, this is mathematically correct. And the qualitative analysis is less correct in that sense. So that's just something I wanted to point out. Now for the Booking.com platforms, I mean, we've seen cases about Booking.com, like you said, in the US, we've seen them all around Europe and Brazil apparently. So there were different approaches taken to those cases. Like in Germany, but that was an older case, it's a few years old now. That was 2015, and they actually discarded the non-paying side, the user side, and said, we're only going to look at this from a platform hotel angle. And I think we've overcome this, or I think most jurisdictions have overcome this. And actually Germany introduced a provision saying that now non-price markets are also markets. So they specifically put that in the law. So maybe they would look at it different now. But it's something we'll have to ask each other in every single case. What is the market we're looking at? And that directly links to the ecosystem question, I think. But if you think of not just Booking.com, but also Uber, for example, there's been cases not in competition law, but in other areas of European law that came before the Court of Justice, where the question was, is Uber a transportation provider, providing a transportation service, or is it an information society service? And same with Airbnb, is it an accommodation provider, or is it an information society service? And there can be arguments in the one way or the other. What's important, I think, is to look beyond this and see what they're doing. And as Magali said, in individual cases, that might be different. Now, looking at the ecosystems question, we could approach it as we would with multi-sided markets, perhaps, from an angle of, as we do in aftermarket. So just say, okay, we realize that there's different markets here at play. Sometimes we look at the broader platform market or what's above it, the ecosystems, and sometimes we just look at the, like you said, maybe the watch. I think it'll be very difficult to actually make those differentiations in some cases, but maybe it doesn't matter. It really depends on how we use the relevant market. If we want to get what we lawyers would like to get, which is very precise borders, and to say, this is the relevant market, there's a 21% market share, which in Brazil means dominance, and Europe doesn't, and in the US definitely doesn't. But if we want to see that, I think we have to change that perspective before we do anything else, because this false sense of, like in Europe, we like this 30% or 50% market share for either dominance or no dominance at all, because of the AXA judgment and because of the block exemption regulations. But they give us this false sense of, I'm sure that this is the way it is just because the market share is 51% or 29%. So it's not an answer to your question, but it's another question saying, could we change our approach to the relevant market so that it makes more sense? Because if we look at some of those markets and we see and understand how they function and how they interact with each other, and what a data advantage, for example, means on a broader scale, because this is having a data advantage is a massive competitive advantage, just like, for example, being an ecosystem, a successful ecosystem can also be a massive competitive advantage, then maybe that's more valuable than having the precise market definition that we would like to see, but that we probably cannot see in individual cases. Difficult, of course, for an enforcer to then actually enforce this. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Vicky. So we're gonna now pass to the questions of the audience. I have a first question here from Paula. Does the SNIP tool work for market definition in this kind of markets? Certain authors think that this tool fails to assess some characteristics of this market on these markets are present. So do you think maybe you can just throw out market, hypothetical market test and things like that in digital markets? For instance, if you think about Facebook and Instagram case, that's now on the spotlight, the face. Do you think that kind of exercise is fit and produce some good results? I don't know who to start.
Right, so I'll just briefly start at this time. So an excellent question, because of course, that's what we'd always like to do, apply old tools to new cases without many changes and have them still work. So as we said, I think in the case of digital markets, there will have to be an adaptation. And as Magali said, you can try and have, instead of an increase in prices, you can try and model a decrease in quality. It's been done before, but maybe the metrics will not fit very well. So it might as well just using this test might give us a false sense of we've managed to see what the test would give us. So perhaps it's, yeah, as the question actually says, the SNP test can only take price in its traditional form, only takes this price increase into account. So then you lose all the other aspects of what quality is. And quality can mean different things. I mean, it can be a loss or an increase in privacy protection. It can be an increase in functionalities of my social media platform and so on. So that's something I think the more factors you take into account for such a test, the more complicated it will become. And then, of course, it's more difficult to rely on such tests simply because they don't give us the definite answer. So, yeah.
If Magali or Paula wants to say something?
It's very short addition. I think the advantage and the reason there is love for something like a hypothetical monopolist test or a SNP test is that it seems to be something that is based on measurable consumer reaction that can be replicated. There is much to be said for having a test that does that. My misgivings about qualitative analysis are not about qualitative analysis in se, but the fact that it is being done in a way that isn't easy to replicate or double check. If you can make qualitative analysis better, then go with qualitative analysis. The advantage of the SNP test would exist for qualitative analysis as well. The reason I was trying to think about personal data as a price was because I wanted to provide a tool we can use that is measurable and can be replicated. Although I usually say in my classes to my students, measuring something doesn't make it true, but at least it makes it something you can do again and again and again and try to figure out whether you see the same answer. So yes, the SNP test fails. So make an alternative SNP test or make another test that can be replicated. That's the problem we saw, I think, in the Google Shopping case. Different people came to different answers based on the same facts. That's not okay.
Hey, Paula, do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I would just, I'd like to echo what Magali just said. I think that's also my concern with qualitative analysis is that you can't have two different conclusions based on the same facts. That shows that there's something wrong with the tool. So for me, qualitative analysis is not, as she said, a problem in and of itself, but I would like for something to be just a little bit more objective so that it can be double checked. You can remove the first person bias. That to me would be the most important thing.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have another question from the audience, and I'm gonna make these questions with another one made by Professor Vicente Bagnoli also. So the question is if you can treat digital markets in different levels. So have some differentiation in digital markets about market definition. And Professor Vicente Bagnoli has an article that says about using the digital markets and big data as three markets: capture, storage, and analysis of data. So this could be like three different markets. What do you think about that? You can have these levels, these layers of market definition in digital markets?
Is it all right if I pick up on that?
Yeah.
To me, there's two things about that. That's all right. That's what we do. That's what we do traditionally, right? So if you look at the cases by the European Commission and CADE in Brazil for payment cards, that's what they did. They looked at the different levels in the payment system, and each level had its own significance. But even if we move away from this platform debate, that's what we do traditionally. If you have a vertical relationship with loads of aftermarkets, each of them can be a different market, and whether it is relevant will depend on the facts of the case. It will depend on the alleged conduct. It will depend on the players that are involved. So I think that's a brilliant suggestion because it is what we already do and it makes sense. Maybe sometimes you get a bit hung up on the idea that, and I've said this before in different fora, that market definition is something that you have in one case and then that same market is relevant to all other cases. No, there are different markets, different levels, and depending on the case, it will change which level matters. So I think that goes really more to the point than might even be intended when you ask the question. It is a very relevant question.
Okay, thank you, Magali. I don't know if Vicky or Paulo wants to say something. No,
nothing to add. Maybe just that it's also that if you have a market definition is a snapshot of time, right? Looking at when, and depending on whether it's ex ante or ex post, but just giving a snapshot in time of what the market was like at this particular time, or what it will be like in the future, or what do you think it will be like. But that also means, especially in those digital markets that are prone to a lot of change, that it just changes as well. So relying on a market definition, like I said in the Booking.com case from 2015, might not be a good idea because the markets have evolved. And so today we might have to look at it anew. Although, of course, for companies, I understand that the first thing you do when you get a case is you look at past market definitions. That's, in your nature to do that. But just keep in mind that markets might have changed to such a degree that it's just different today.
Okay. I don't know if Paula wants to say something.
No, I think I would echo those comments, and the only, I guess, little bit of pushback that I would give is, while all of that is true, I would just be careful not to define the market based on the violation that's being investigated, but rather on the market itself. I know maybe not everyone agrees with me, and maybe I'm not going to be that's not going to be the majority opinion in most places, but I think that's important.
I would second that.
So I think there is no more questions from the audience. I can just, I think, ask one final question from me, and then we can finish the panel. I don't know. One of the things that I was thinking about when we were talking is that how do you think this spillover is going to be about the other markets? So maybe if you can develop a quantitative test for the market definition in digital markets. Do you think it's going to be like a standard for other markets? It's going to change the whole market definition issue, or do you think it's going to be more in that niche of digital markets? You're going to have two different ways of defining markets.
Who do you want to go first? I'll just go, okay, because I already muted myself. So I think that's an excellent question, because that, of course, it also alludes to the broader picture that we want to see. So I think there's two ways that what might happen. The first is that, for example, there's been a German report called Competition Law 2.0, and they suggested that perhaps we need a separate market definition notice for digital markets and a separate notice for market power assessments in digital markets. And I think what lies at the bottom of that suggestion is that we should see two different ways of analyzing relevant markets in digital markets and in non-digital markets. But that, of course, is very difficult. And I think perhaps we should find a way to combine the two, simply because so many markets are being digitalized. As we speak, offline and online markets are converging. Many markets that are very traditional, all of a sudden, especially with the corona epidemic, they're seeing a surge in digitalization. So if we say that we want to separate digital market definition from mainstream or traditional market definition, that might not end well, especially if you take into account legal certainty. So perhaps there might be some special rules, especially when you think about how to define those ecosystems, because that's quite specific to some digital markets. But overall, I think we should have a broader approach, and that would then mean that there might be some spillover effect from what we're thinking about in digital markets to more traditional markets, but also vice versa. I mean, a lot of what I've thought about in digital markets actually comes from aftermarkets, and that's a very traditional way of analyzing relevant markets. So, spillover effects in both directions.
I'll just add to that I think this is a question that resonates beyond market definition. So I mean, I don't know if Vicky and Paula will agree with me, but there is a lot of this regulation going on specifically for digital markets. And although I understand the initial push, this is something we're struggling with. This is something new. It's something we want to do, right? I'm not quite sure what that says for the future. You can't have a completely separate regime, especially when digitalization and online and offline are moving together, for one, without spillover effects on the other. So if we start with something separate now, I don't know how many years from now, but I'm willing to put a bet on the table that it's not going to be more than 10. Eventually, that distinction will have evaporated for regulation and for market definition. But maybe this is too bold, but you regulate digital markets now, 10 years from now, we're going to have used those principles on normal markets because it's an artificial boundary. It really is.
Oh, so let's make a bet. And Paula.
I would just add that more than digital and non-digital, maybe we also need to think about for zero price and positive price, because I think one of the things that we see a lot of in notification, in merger notification forms are, you know, a lot of the information is based on market share, revenues, and this is something that doesn't necessarily exist in, doesn't exist in zero price markets, and a lot of the critical information kind of, you know, gets it creeps through and the authority doesn't really get a sense of exactly what necessary information is. So maybe we need to rethink these forms to apply to zero price markets, and just like we're seeing zero price markets in digital, I think we can find examples of zero price markets and platforms in the real world as well.
Thank you very much, Paula. So I think we can end our very nice conversation. It was very informative, very fun, and very pleasant to be here with you three. Brilliant professors. So I think we're going to have the final word of each one of you. I don't know who wants to start first. It's Vicky, maybe she spoke at first.
Final words. Final words. I haven't thought of anything. So I think when we think about digital markets and market definition, I do not believe that market definition will go away. I do believe that market definition will have to change, or our approach to market definition will have to change in some of the ways that we discussed today. And one of that I think will be an important step is to go away from saying market definition is only good for having a market power assessment and going towards understanding that it's equally important, and maybe in digital markets more important, to have it to understand and characterize markets so we understand the theories of harm and see whether or not they're actually, you know, materializing or not. So that will be my final words. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Magali?
Yeah, as a final word, I think, I mean, this is really interesting, and these are the kind of conversations that we like to have, because we very often don't have much time to talk about market definition. You know, we're market definition nerds, and people don't understand our obsession. So I actually think it's an important conversation, and I like that we can talk also in relation to Brazil about it, because some of the stuff that CADE has been doing recently has actually made me reflect on the fact that, you know, you've got the EU doing their thing, the US doing their thing, but then Brazil looks back and says, okay, but why, and should we use that? And I think in a way this is these kind of conversations from the Brazilian perspective and other perspectives help us much more to move things further than if you just do it in silos. So I second Vicky. I think market definition will change and focus more on market characterization, but I also think that we need to do it from the perspective of other jurisdictions at the same time and not just our own.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I would just like to say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's keep market definition. Let's try to refine it. Let's try to make it as applicable and as efficient as possible, because it does serve a purpose, and I think that it will continue to serve a purpose. And I think what Magali just said is very true. Any kind of, in the way the world is evolving, any kind of boundary between brick and mortar and digital is evaporating, and soon everything's going to be the same thing. So we're going to start talking about traditional and new markets, and honestly, everything's going to be traditional because that's all we're going to know. So I think that market definition should, be kept in the toolbox, and it just needs to be refined a little bit more.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the audience for having the time to watch us, and thank you, the three of you. And